What happened in the world of poetry in 2015? My colleagues Greg Cowles and Parul Sehgal will join me to talk about the year in poetry.
This was also a year where there was a lot of conversation about poetry that left the poetry world. There was a lot of controversy, and we actually have an essay that talks a little bit about the way that poetry has been reckoning with race.
Who are the very persistent gappers of Fripp? George Saunders will be here to tell you about the one and only children's book he's written and what makes writing for kids so hard.
They didn't like the stories where somebody vanquished somebody, where there was a bad person and the hero killed him or something, or just won. But they liked it when there was a quiet victory followed by a kind of a redemption of the enemy a little bit,
Alexandra Alter will give us an update from the literary world, and Greg Cowles has bestseller news. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. This week, the book review looks at the year in poetry. And to talk about that year in poetry, two of my colleagues join us now, Greg Cowles and Parul Sehgal. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
So let's talk about what's in this issue, and then we'll talk a little bit about our favorite poems.
Sure. Well, of course, the year in poetry is really a vast undertaking, and there was no way to do more than glance at it in this issue.
That's a very nice caveat lead there.
Everything you left out.
And so the goal with this issue was to kind of take a broad sampling so that we have some young poets, some more established poets, some people writing within very established forms.
Some dead poets.
There are some dead poets in this issue. We've got a couple of biographies of poets in the issue as well. It was really more to give a sense of what's out there right now, take the temperature of the poetry world.
Yeah. And also the critics. I think we have a really nice sampling of people writing in this issue, from Maureen N. McLean, Megan O'Rourke, Shrikant Reddy. So it's a really nice, I think, sampling also of people that are doing very interesting criticism of writing poetry.
And it was a nice opportunity for us to bring some people into the book review who had not written for us before.
Natalie Diaz.
Yeah.
Is she a poet?
She is a poet. Yeah, she's got a very fine book out called When My Brother Was an Aztec. So
even if in a glancing, incomplete way, we're still talking about the year in poetry, what kind of year was it?
This was also a year where there was a lot of conversation about poetry that left the poetry world. There was a lot of controversy, and we actually have an essay that talks a little bit about the way that poetry has been reckoning with race, badly mostly. And that's by Sonia Posmentier, who is a professor at NYU, and she talks about the controversy with Best American Poetry, in which a poem submitted under a Chinese name was revealed to be written by a white man, as well as some other sorts of controversies with people. There's one poet, Kenneth Goldsmith, who read aloud An Autopsy of Michael Brown as a sort of found poem, and another woman, Vanessa Place, who's been tweeting out this year portions of...
For years,
but scandal sort of erupted this year. She's been tweeting out excerpts of, or line by line, Gone with the Wind. And so she sort of takes the temperature.
Both of those poets are white. Both of them are dealing with race and racial politics in their work. And so there's been a lot of question about how they're doing that, whether they should even be allowed to do that. I think there's no question they should be allowed to if they
But how well are they doing it,
yes,
and why
exactly.
are they doing it? And I think that there's been a lot of hiding behind, this is conceptual poetry. And I think what this essay does in a very interesting way is looks at Black conceptual poets and the way that they have looked at race.
Right. And so maybe even more than in kind of the rest of the literary world in general, you ask about the year in poetry, it has been a year where poetry is really grappling with politics and with questions of identity.
That's a very good point. There's a great review here by Maureen N. McLean. It's Anne Boyer's book, Garments Against Women. And it's, people think of poetry as being so rarefied and apart from the rest of the world, but these are poems about poverty and illness and motherhood that feel very granular and gritty and of the moment.
We're just trying to lift the holiday spirits here.
Always.
There's another review in here by Benjamin Hollander of the poet Ed Pavlik, who teaches in Georgia. He is a mixed-race poet who often in his work deals with questions of racial politics in America and in the world. He's got some poems here set in Palestine and in Croatia, which is where his father's family comes from. And so he talks a lot about kind of how our identity shifts depending on the context of the society that we're in. Mm-hmm. Ed Pavlik is working very much in the prose poetry format that Anne Boyer is also working at in Garments Against Women, and that poets like Claudia Rankine. There's this real drive, almost like mini essays. They're like lyrical essays or prose poems that are kind of dealing with some of these themes.
And interrogate the poem itself by doing so.
Yeah.
Right? They're constantly pushing and asking, is this a poem? Why isn't this a poem? Why could this also be a poem? And some of that energy and tension is really interesting.
Yeah.
The same kind of crossing of genre that's happening in fiction.
Yeah.
Exactly. And in fact, where you see it a lot in fiction, there are writers who started out as poets or who remain poets but are writing fiction. People like Ben Lerner.
All right, you both got Ben Lerner. Do we have another one?
That one.
Another poet,
That's the
right?
trend.
Garth Greenwell, too, is since you need another name.
Our poetry columnist, David Orr, has his favorite books of poetry of the year, which is online. But do each of you have a favorite book of poetry that you read this year?
I have a favorite book of poetry I reread this year. I'm constantly rereading this book. It's so
Way
good.
to slip out of the answer.
I'm such a fraud. But no, I really did reread this, and I kept this in my purse. It just like took up residence. It's a book called Our Andromeda by Brenda Shaughnessy, who is a friend, and it's a beautiful book about motherhood and sort of raising her child who has cerebral palsy and just ambition and wanting to be a writer, and it's just beautiful and sonorous and
For me, the poets that I kind of constantly return to are the poets who really got me into reading poetry in the first place. When I was like 13 years old, I stumbled across in my local library a copy of Robert Hass's book, Praise, I think it was. No, Field Guide, his very first book. It won the Yale Younger Poets that year. So there's this kind of openness to nature. It's almost, nature poetry and epiphany poetry. I think the formal term for it might be lyrical narrative. It's free verse, appreciation, and close observation of the world. So Robert Hass is somebody that I go back to a lot. Philip Levine, working in kind of the same vein. His book, What Work Is a book that I reread.
Both of you avoided saying a book that was published this year, but that kind of brings me around to a roundup we did, asking people what their favorite poem is, because many of these poems that people cited were not necessarily new. We asked a wide range of people, everyone from Junot Diaz to Lena Dunham, Shonda Rhimes, John Green, Jeanette Winterson, John Waters, Stephen King, Gillian Flynn. I could go on and on and on. But let's talk about a few of their choices.
One that I love is John Waters calling out Joyce Kilmer's Trees as a poem that...
Of course he would do something like that.
The first poem that, quote, stirred him sexually. And
I have to acknowledge on air. No, I've been familiar with that poem for a long time. I had no idea
it was a woman.
That Joyce Kilmer is a man.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
I thought Joyce Kilmer was a woman.
Yeah. So he's great. He finds all sorts of, as John Waters would, all sorts of perverse undercurrents in this poem.
I was pleased to see Lena Dunham single out Robert Lowell. There's a whole category of course, Auden and Eliot and Philip Larkin, Elizabeth Bishop, James Merrill, and Robert Lowell is part of that category of writers who have like ferocious control and dexterity, but who could still strike a conversational tone even within the tight limits of the form.
And playfulness.
Yeah. And more than that, then within all that, they had something to say. And so Lena Dunham singles out Man and Wife by Robert Lowell.
Yeah. I mean, it is really striking about how, like, so many of these writers chose poems that really dovetail with their themes.
Yeah.
Julian Barnes chose this poem by one of my favorite poets, A.E. Housman. The poem is The Laws of God. It's sort of this like really disciplined, despairing poem that sort of has in its penultimate line, if keep we can, which is such a Barnesian theme, right? If you can endure, how to endure, one must endure.
Similarly, Ta-Nehisi Coates singles out Robert Hayden and his long poem, Middle Passage, which is looking back at America's kind of founding as a colony built on slavery. That's the original sin of America, and it's very much ties into Ta-Nehisi Coates' themes in his work.
Anyone just completely surprise you with their choice?
You mentioned John Green earlier, and I was a little bit surprised. He writes, young adult novels, and Mo Willems, who writes picture books, singled out Dr. Seuss, which you might expect. But John Green singled out John Keats. And the poem that he picked is in some ways not even a poem at all. It's a single toss-away line that Keats wrote in his Last Will and Testament. The final item of his Last Will and Testament begins, "My chest of books divide among my friends," and it's this perfect iambic pentameter. It's it is essentially a poem. John Green says that he points out how the middle word of that short line is divide. It's the word that divides that line of poetry. He says he keeps circling back to it and thinking about mortality and how we deal with those that we love and the things that we love.
But those are John Green's themes.
Yeah, that's true. It's not a surprise at all when you think about it.
I mean, nobody surprised me in that way, but I was grateful for an introduction to so many poets I hadn't heard of. Junot Diaz recommended a poet named Aracelis Girmay, whose poem is Kingdom Animalia, that he said brought him a lot of comfort after his sister died. Elena Ferrante recommended an Italian poet named Emilio Rosselli. So there are a whole bunch of names and snippets of poetry that were just felt fresh and new and from other worlds.
All right, and now I'm going to do this to you. What's your favorite poem, Parul?
Oh my God. Well, keeping with my general theme, despair, apparently, it's Carrying Comfort by Gerard Manley Hopkins, which is an intensely sad, dramatic, kind of histrionic poem. It's like sort of culmination of the dark night of the soul. Or so I think. It's one of those poems that the sound of it is so beautiful. And I can still remember the first time I heard it and just not knowing that language could do that. It's just this wonderful lapping energy, and it just sounds like an incantation. And at the end of the poem, you look around and you're like, something has to have happened. So what it's about, I'm still foggy, but it's in my bones. It's so good.
And Greg?
Favorites are hard. And, we asked all these people to come up with favorites very cavalierly. and then you asked us to think about our favorites, and I suddenly freaked out.
Now you know what we do to people.
I mean, the first poem that really grabbed me as a young adult, as a high school student, was Philip Levine's "Animals Are Passing From Our Lives," which is written from the perspective of a pig on its way to slaughter. And of course, it's really a poem about death and the machinery of death and how we conduct ourselves in the face of the inevitable. This is a pig with great dignity, refusing to be afraid of what he knows is coming. But you asked for favorites, and I mean, they can be very personal and idiosyncratic. I have to confess to a soft spot for an obscure poem by a guy named Charlie Smith. He's like Dennis Johnson. He's a poet and a fiction writer, like Ben Lerner, a poet and a fiction writer. He wrote a poem called "Now I Smack My Head," which I saw in a small literary journal when I was maybe 19 years old. And it was later collected in his book, Indistinguishable from the Darkness. And it's the kind of poem I was talking about before, a poem of epiphany, close observation. It's about not taking yourself too seriously. It's got a cameo by Laurel and Hardy in it. It's got rain dripping from ginkgo trees. When I was an insufferable college student, I had it as the outgoing message on my phone for a month or two. Yes, to the mostly tolerant bewilderment of my callers, I did. Yes.
All right, and now to the bewilderment of our listeners here, Greg, Parul. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela.
Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk about the year in literary news. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So this is our year-end issue. Gives us a chance to talk about what happened in the literary world in 2015. I feel like I'm going to know what your number one story is.
Why don't you take a stab at it?
Was it one that took up 3 months of our podcasts?
Yes.
An unknown author, yes, with her sophomore effort, Go Set a Watchman.
Yeah, I mean, of all the big surprises in publishing this year, and there were so many of them, I mean, from ebook sales falling to independent stores doing well to audiobooks blowing up, people buying coloring books. I mean, it was a crazy year. I think probably the biggest bombshell was the second novel by Harper Lee, published more than 50 years after To Kill a Mockingbird, and nobody expected that. We didn't expect a previously unpublished book by Dr. Seuss to turn up either, so that was another big surprise.
This was a surprising year, now that you list all those things. What was
I mean, really, apart from Harper Lee, I think coloring books is my number one kind of shocking trend because it really seemed like such a fad in the early spring when it started with Joanna Basford, who's this queen of coloring books. She was the first author to break out in this exploding category, and now her books have sold more than 16 million copies all over the world, and the trend has not gone away. There's more than 150 adult coloring books on the market now, according to Publishers Weekly. We're seeing adaptations of books by, J.K. Rowling and George R.R. Martin and Diana Gabaldon, and Barnes & Noble has its own coloring book section near the cash registers. It's just become this kind of staple category now for publishers.
Let's try to figure out what's going on, because I have a couple of theories and I want to hear yours. I think that it's a kind of shop craft for soul craft, kind of very accessible version of that people want to get back to an easy, tangible, manual activity.
I think that's absolutely right. I think it's the tactile nature of it. It's not a screen, it's very kind of meditative, and it's also approachable. What Joanna Basford told me when I interviewed her, she said she thought a lot of people were intimidated by drawing something of their own, kind of creating the image, but when it came to filling in, somebody else's image, that seemed absolutely doable and relaxing. So I think that could be part of it. It's still crazy that it's become such a popular category.
It's like Sudoku or Ken, but not as hard.
Exactly. And in terms of other kind of surprising formats, we're still seeing this major growth in digital audio, which is exciting. I think publishers are really enthusiastic about it. They're putting out more and more audiobooks to kind of feed the demand, but digital audio sales were up almost 40% in the first 7 months of this year. Meanwhile, ebook sales have tapered off, and nobody was expecting that either. They fell 11% in the first 7 months of 2015 compared to the previous year. So that's been surprising, and I think publishers, are a little wary of that. They don't necessarily want ebook sales to fall any further because in some cases they're not making up, the revenue in print, and they're losing the ebook sales possibly to as readers turn to cheaper self-published books. That's kind of been a surprising shift that nobody was expecting.
Right.
And finally, I thought it was kind of interesting this year, and we talked about this, I think, on another podcast, that there was not really a breakout literary novel. After previous years where we had The Goldfinch or Anthony Doerr's All the Light We Cannot See, there wasn't one must-read, most discussed book of the year. And I was curious about why that was, and I was looking at the bestseller list, and I wondered if maybe it's because people are still buying All the Light We Cannot See. So I contacted Scribner, the publisher, and it turns out that's the case. They shipped 2.3 million copies in 2015, compared to, the year it came out, 2014, they shipped 1 million copies. So you can see that more and more people are still buying that book.
What was the most fun story for you to report?
I loved learning about Dr. Seuss. I wrote about the newly discovered book and how they put it together, and Maria Russo wrote a beautiful essay looking at his legacy and why his books are so popular still. What I loved about it was because they had to kind of reconstruct his creative process to make this book, which was really just ink drawings and some verses, into a publishable book. I learned a lot about how he worked, and I never realized the rhymes are so sort of silly and fun and easy, but really they were painstakingly crafted. Same with the colors. He was obsessive about which colors he picked. He just did so many drafts over and over. And so his editor went through a similar process, trying to replicate what he might have done to make this book come together. So that was probably one of the most satisfying stories that I worked on.
And since we're talking about mosts and bests and those kind of things, what was the best thing you read this year?
In terms of the books that I tore through, and for me that's a pretty good barometer of how engaged I am, I loved Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff. Seeing a marriage from two perspectives is not a brand new idea in fiction, but the execution I thought was beautiful. It was such a surprising turn that the book took when you went to the wife's perspective and realized how different everything looked.
Yes.
And the language was beautiful, and I love just kind of the overlaying of the sense of mythology that she brought to it. And I also love Purity by Jonathan Franzen. I thought it really got at some of the issues that we're grappling with as a culture, as a society, with how much of our information we're willing to give over for convenience, for security, all those things that are still coming up in the news. He got at with his kind of sweeping novel about a journalist and a hacker and their kind of tortured relationship.
Those are both two very long books, I would just like to point out, which probably explains a lot about Alexandra's success in her position, and is that she is a super reader, a super fast reader. How many books do you have to read generally for your reporting here?
I tend to read 2 books a week usually. I do read quickly, and when the books are gripping, it really helps. Of course, Dr. Seuss didn't take too long, but it was equally engaging.
That week you read 3 books.
That's right.
Okay. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
George Saunders joins us now. He is the author for adults, most recently of Congratulations, by the way, and the story collection 10th of December, and is also here to celebrate the 15th anniversary reissue of a children's book, The Very Persistent Gappers of Fripp. He joins me along with Maria Russo, our children's book editor, and we are going to talk about kids' books. So welcome, George.
Nice to be here.
And Maria.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, so let's just talk about this book, The Very Persistent Gappers of Fripp, illustrated by Lane Smith. This was originally published in 2000. How did this book come about?
Well, when our kids were little, I'm like an obsessive rewriter, like almost a little clinically deranged. And so when the kids were little, I would just go in sometimes and just try to improvise a story, which for me was kind of unusual. So maybe, for a 3 or 4 month period, I would just go in and they'd say, so I made up this little girl character and we just kind of riff to them. And the thing that was great about it was having, an audience that was close and also beloved to you, is you could tell when you were hitting it. Sometimes you were boring them, sometimes you were on. So 2 daughters, and I could just notice that whenever I would tell a story where they didn't like the stories where somebody vanquished somebody, where there was a bad person and the hero killed them or something, or just won. But they liked it when there was a quiet victory followed by a kind of a redemption of the enemy a little bit, And I really noticed this in their reactions. If I ended the story too, kind of male,
right.
they
too
would kind
happily and triumphantly.
Right. They would kind of, but what else, It became this pattern of stories where usually it was a little girl and she had a kind of a crazy family in a nutty community that were all conspiring to misunderstand her. And she kind of very patiently abided with it and at some moment, threw a switch and turned things around. So out of that whole, period, there was one that I thought had kind of the structure to maybe that I could go take off and obsess about. So this was the one. So I took it off and spent another 4 or 5 months kind of refining it.
All right. What's the story about?
Basically, there's a little, really poor town on a cliff and 3 houses worth, and their economy is goat-based. But every day, 3 or 4 times, these little creatures come out and just overrun the city, thousands of them, and they kind of shut down the goat business. So the tradition has evolved that these kids will go out every day. They're part of their responsibility as good kids is to clear the yards and throw the things back into the ocean, and the whole cycle starts again. And that works for them, kind of. And then one day, for complicated reasons that people have to buy the book to find out, they all come to this one girl's yard. So suddenly the neighbors are completely free of this burden. For me, it's kind of about their reaction to that, the way that they make the mistake that we probably all make, which is to think good fortune for me equals I'm virtuous. And so kind of, hilarity ensues after that.
Did it develop along with the reaction of your children? You said cows and they sort of frowned and then you moved to goats, or
I don't remember. I think it was probably pretty trial and error. They would allow me to revise on the spot a little bit if something got off into the rough.
It's such an interesting way to end up writing fiction in a way. It's like you're workshopping it with your audience as you go along.
And that's my big thing is you're really in the communication business. So when you're writing and revising, you are in an intimate relationship with the reader, and part of that deal is that I'm going to revise so that I indicate that I have a lot of respect for you. I'm going to cut out the dumb stuff and the repetitious stuff and the lazy stuff, and in that way you kind of sit up and go, oh, he sees me over here. So it was great to have that kind of enacted right there, in front of you.
How did you end up getting Lane Smith? You've called him your favorite children's book illustrator ever.
Yeah, I had finished the book and sent it to Random House, and then they said, well, who do you want to send it to? And I said, really, I just want to send it to Lane Smith. And they did, and over the weekend he said yes. So that was, I always say it's kind of like you're getting married in your backyard and the Pope agrees to do the ceremony. So he agreed to do it, and then we just took off from there.
That's not always how it works, Maria, right? I mean, you don't
Right.
often get to choose your illustrator as...
It seems like it's pretty rare these days.
When you do a book, it's great to do the book. And sometimes if you're lucky, there's some peripheral things that happen. And with this experience, I learned a really important lesson about just art, because I went down to Lane's studio maybe a week later, and the walls were just an explosion of beautiful, incredible paintings of this world, and not just in one mode, 2 or 3 different takes on it. And as somebody who tends to be a little fussy, and I sometimes, if I am working hard, my barometer goes into the fear mode rather than joy as a writer. And Lane was just like explosively talented, so very inspiring to see that.
Did you then collaborate at all or change the story as you saw his illustrations coming in?
We tried not to do too much redundant description. So in other words, having those incredible illustrations, and also his wife Molly Leach is a designer, and she's just brilliant. So I became familiar with the concept of page turns, which I didn't know.
A big thing in picture books.
Yeah. So is that something that you guys talk about all the time in the aesthetics of that?
If it works well, you take it for granted and don't even notice it, so you don't have to talk about it.
Right,
you
right.
kind of talk about it when it doesn't work. But these obviously work really well. You want the story to move visually too, so you save something. At the end of each page, you're saving the next bit of the story visually, as well as narratively.
Right. So I learned a lot about that from them, and so that was really, really wonderful. But they're just, it was literally like, just getting the best people in the world to honor your work in a way. So it was a great experience.
Did working on this story, which you originally came out in 2000, did that experience and that collaboration in any way inform your approach to writing for adults?
I think if you'd asked me in 2000, I'd have said something like, well, adult fiction is kind of cautionary. It's supposed to, especially in a nice culture like ours, an affluent culture, it's supposed to remind us that things aren't good for everybody just because they're good for you. Just because things are good for you, they won't be good for you permanently, that kind of effect. And I would have said, but for kids, what we're doing is something different. We're kind of saying, we're reminding them that even though life will be tough, they have resources. So kind of a happy ending mentality. So I kind of gave myself maybe a pass to do a happy ending, which at that time for me was sort of unusual. But in having done it, it was like I sort of trained my artistic body to go, oh, yeah, you can do that. And then I started to think, well, actually, that first definition of fiction was a little modest. Fiction actually can do both at once. It can remind us that things are hard and remind us that we have resources. So in the best, like Chekhov and Tolstoy, that's what it's doing. So I think this kind of, it's almost like if you had a trainer force you to do a certain exercise and then you became aware of a certain muscle group, suddenly then that's yours to use in the future. So I think, especially with 10th of December, I could feel this book kind of somehow working in the back of my mind a little bit.
Do you find that people underestimate children's literature, underestimate the difficulty of writing it?
Oh, I sure did. I thought it's just shorter, and it's so, I had never even tried another one after this because the classics of the form are such a beautiful, combination of a little bit of language. Like I always think of this, a good kid's book would be, John was unusual. And then the next picture is John with a head 6 times the size of a normal head. But if it was John was unusual, he had a big head in the picture. Somehow that's less.
Right.
So those kind of things enter into the cinematic in a way that I'm a little.
I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why people say that the greats, the real greats of children's literature are the author-illustrators because they're able to do that in their head.
Yes.
It's very hard to write that way and then to know how an illustrator is going to interpret.
I think that's right, yeah. But it also struck me how much it's like movies, this whole thing.
I was going to say, speaking of the great author-illustrators, you mentioned Dr. Seuss in your list of your favorite children's books, and there's something so Seussian about this book. And in the vision of the world and the way that children can have power in that world and can actually teach the adults. But the language is really all your own. It seems like you weren't, as you were writing it. A lot of people who are influenced by Seuss end up kind of sounding like him, but I feel like in this book you don't sound that much like him. It's more kind of on a deep level.
Yeah, he's a bit like the Hemingway of kids lit.
Right,
if you touch that, it's danger.
Yeah, there's a Loraxian quality even to this.
To the cover.
Cover.
Yeah. It's funny. Actually, Dr. Seuss saved my writing life because when I was as an engineer, I was writing this real Hemingway-esque stuff. And was reading a lot of kids' books to our kids, especially the Sneetches. That was when I really, just one of those kids' books that, if you're a parent, you know that there's a set of kids' books that you hate because they're so obnoxious, but somehow your kids like them and you have to read them.
Oh, yes.
Well, the Sneetch was the opposite. The Sneetch was like, you guys want to read the Sneetches 10
right,
times? I'll be
totally.
happy to do it. I'll do all the voices and I'll put on the costumes. And But doing a lot of that reading. And then one day I was in a conference call at my job. I was a tech writer. For some reason, out of the corner of my mind, I just started writing these little Seussian, which are so addictive to try, And they're a little pornographic, actually, a little funny and, scatological. But they actually had a little bit of zing to them. And I just finished this big book, this 700-page book about a novel about this Mexican wedding that was just death between covers. It was so boring. And but I brought this little pamphlet home and put it on the table, and I heard my wife laughing from the next room, which she hadn't reacted, no one had reacted with any pleasure to my work in a long time. And there was something in being free to use that Seussian voice, and that in turn reminded me that, dummy, it's about fun. You're supposed to have fun. That's
right.
all it is. So that was a real...
I often take that parenting challenge of speaking to my children and that Seussian...
The cadences.
I think you
yes.
better stop it. You better stop it now.
Right.
Yeah.
Maria referred to a list that you did of your favorite children's books. This was back in 2001 for the excellent blog Dinner, A Love Story, which is obviously not just about food because it's run by the very literary Jenny Rosenstrack and in part by her husband, Andy Ward. What are some of the books that you called out as your favorites on that list?
Well, one of the ones that I found with our kids was this Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It came in a cassette at that time, and it was narrated by Glenn Close, and it was the scariest single reading. Our kids finally wouldn't let me do it anymore because it was too scary. You get scared of everything, of Glenn Close. And, the other one that I used to love is this one called Joyful Noise by Paul Fleischman. And it's just basically sort of a script for the parent and the child to do poem
poetry.
Yeah, it was like sort of co-read a poem together, and it really was sweet because it's sort of not easy. It takes a little bit of coordination, and you're both focusing on the task, and it was really rich to do that. Yeah.
One of the things I noticed, maybe a few common threads in the books that you called out, a lot of fables, a lot of things that sort of felt like folk tales handed down through the ages,
Yeah.
The Caps for Sale, Millions of Cats.
Yeah.
And then also moral stories in a way. And I'm wondering if you're drawn to that kind of children's literature.
Oh, yeah, very much. I think actually even adult literature, I like it simple and I like it kind of mythic a little bit and kind of just I love the simple brushstroke idea where you're not claiming to put the whole world into the thing, but you're getting it. It's like the Charlie Brown Christmas special model of literature, where you're seeing a kind of a minimalist, maybe exaggerated, deformed even version of things, and you're meant to read meaning out of that. I'm just attracted to that for some reason.
There's also, I think, a kind of dark quality to a lot of the books that you have. Edward Gorey, Maurice Sendak. It's a question I wonder about often, that who's drawn more to the dark, the children reading the books or being read to, or the parents reading them? And I sometimes think that parents really, or perhaps it's a certain kind of parent, really wants their children to be exposed to that kind of dark
Right.
world through literature.
We're doing Dostoevsky tonight, Timmy.
That's right.
Yeah. I have a thought that maybe these dark tales are needed at certain times. I mean, if you read the Grimm brothers, those are basically, don't be stupid, be careful, listen to me. The world will kill you if you don't listen to me, which was probably more true at that time. I don't know. I sort of feel like the thing that's needed culturally right now is some kind of a rigorous defense of tenderness, of the idea that strength is also being willing to stop for somebody else and lift them up. Or, it seems like somehow we become a bit, in my view, a little bit materialistic and analytical, almost without us noticing it. And sort of the old virtues of charity and, tolerance and patience are kind of like, yeah. We'll do that if we can maintain the shareholder value, So I think I'm kind of newly drawn to stories. Like there's one in here called The 100 Dresses.
Oh, yeah,
such a
the
beautiful,
Eleanor
tender
Estes.
story. Yeah. And it's just, that's a masterpiece because a kid reading that, there's not a line where it says, try to be loving to the kids among you who are a little bit less than you, but the whole story says that. I think almost in the last line, it just pops in your head. It's such a compassionate
And there's this
story.
great theme also in the very persistent Gappers of Fripp of just neighborliness, that I think is really important now too, that we live in these communities with each other and we have to share certain burdens
that's right.
and help each other out.
Yeah.
And that's another theme I don't think you see that much.
Yeah, and sort of this idea, this contemporary idea, or maybe it's not contemporary, but of circling the wagons, that we can't afford to go too far out of that circle bit of wagons or things might get dangerous. And I think you see this in the immigration debate and even this new stuff about terrorism is the idea that our safety is paramount and it's worth a whole lot of other a lot of other people's freedoms. And I think that's something that, I guess those of us who maybe were taught it take it for granted, but you can sort of see that a cultural value can just kind of subtly shift and be lost, you know. So I think a lot of the great kids' books have a kind of tenderness at the heart of them, or, you know, very, very sort of lofty moral ambitions, actually. And then the trick, of course, is the bad kids' books are so overt about it that any kid with any sense would walk away and go rob a bank or something. I mean,
All right, I have to ask you now about specific bad books, just because you brought it up twice, the books that you hate to read to your children and the ones that are just bad.
I honestly have them blocked.
You blocked them out.
I blocked them out. You know what's funny, though, as a writer and a creative writing instructor, is what makes a bad book, because it's not – usually it's just a slight turn of the dial. And I think it has something to do with the writer being too aware of and too proud of his or her cleverness, you know. So instead, which goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, the respect for the reader isn't there because they are overestimating their own cleverness, and then you get it about page 2 and go, all right, I see where this is going. And I think bad kids books tend to have rote repetitions of motifs that you see it coming for the 15th time, you know. But I don't know.
It's like a very misguided way. There's a certain amount of repetition to teach children who are learning to read.
Right.
But then sometimes that's incorporated in books that aren't even necessarily about teaching the child to read. Maybe a little bit too much teaching the parent to read. So this is coming out now again for the 15th. Its 15th anniversary. Why now? And did you change anything? And
no, I mean, the book is essentially the book. It's a beautiful new appearance. And, you know, honestly, Lane and I think we both felt like it was just a incredibly happy accident that we got together. We were so pleased with the results, you know. And then when it came out, it kind of didn't do – I mean, we did this thing where at that time, somebody had mentioned cross-marketing, which meant we put it in the kids section and the adult section. And then just before it came out, we found out that actually wasn't a thing, you know. So so Lane, you know,
it sounded good.
It sounded great. It sounded very 90s. But Lane had, you know, at that time had millions of readers, and I had 9 or 10 if you include my uncle. Unfortunately, it ended up over because it's small. It ended up over in the adult section. So I think it kind of missed its moment a little bit. Yeah. And just, you know, over the years, you know, I've read from it, and he's read from it, and we just felt like, somehow it feels like a book that hasn't quite gotten its chance. So it's kind of a labor of love. And then Andy Ward, who is my editor at Random House, I think his kids were fans. And so, you know, one day I said, you know, could we possibly give that another shot? Because I think it actually had gone out of print. So we brought it back, and beautiful new cover. And
giving it another shot then.
Yeah,
the title again is The Very Persistent Gappers of Fripp by George Saunders, illustrated by Lane Smith. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
a pleasure.
This is John Williamson, editor at The Times, and I'm here with Greg Cowles, who has the last bestseller update of 2015. Hey, Greg.
Hey, John. Or it's the first of 2016, depending how you look at it.
Fair enough.
This is the bestseller list that will appear in the issue of January 3rd, 2016, but it covers sales for December 13th through 19th.
And it's up online now for people to see.
It is. So if no news is good news, there's a lot of good news on the list this week, because there's literally nothing new on the hardcover fiction list, nothing new on the hardcover nonfiction list, nothing new on the children's middle grade hardcover list, or the young adult hardcover list, or the picture books list, or the series list.
Okay.
The only new title anywhere, in fact, is on the combined fiction list. It is James Rollins' new novel. It's his latest Sigma Force thriller. The Bone Labyrinth is new at number 9 on the combined fiction list, and it's hovering just off of the hardcover list at number 17.
Might get there in a week or two.
Yeah, exactly.
Depending on how many people buy it for the holidays. It doesn't sound like a real holiday-themed book.
No, well, it's got Adam and Eve in it, so there's a little bit of religion. This does James Rollins' typical kind of mashup of science and conspiracy theory and religion and myth. It's kind of Michael Crichton meets Dan Brown.
Well, it sounds like definitely a formula for a bestseller.
James Rollins is a regular on this list with this kind of thing. And I mean, it's all kind of preposterous, but also good fun. And you can tell he's just having a good time with it.
That's great. So we will see you in the new year?
You will, sure.
Well, in the meantime, happy holidays.
And same to you, John.
Thanks, Greg.
Bye-bye.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.